Good evening, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for coming tonight. Welcome to Low Library here on the Columbia University campus. My name is David Sandalow. I'm the Inaugural Fellow here at the Center on Global Energy Policy, and I'm the founding director of our China program. I'm really excited about tonight's event. We're going to talk about electric vehicle charging in China. How's that? We're going to talk about electric vehicle charging in China and the United States. We've got some tremendous experts to talk about this topic. I'm going to start by presenting a report that I just released on that topic, explain what we found, and then I'm going to invite my colleagues to the table to speak about this. Let me introduce them. We've got three very distinguished panelists, starting with Shirley Chung, the president of State Grid Corporation in China, U.S. Thank you, Shirley. Play a big hand, absolutely. Absolutely. Shirley Chung started her career in 1991 in the Department of International Cooperation of China's Electricity Council. Since then, she's been intensively involved in international cooperation between China's power sector and the international community. She's held major positions in charge of international affairs in China State Power Corporation and State Grid Corporation of China. She has a bachelor's of English literature from Beijing Second Foreign Language Institute and a master's degree in business management from Cheng University. Thank you for coming. Sure. Our second speaker is Kevin Tu. Kevin. Kevin has recently joined the Center on Global Energy Policy as a fellow. He previously served as China Program Manager at the International Energy Agency in Paris. And before joining the IEA, Kevin was director of the China Energy and Climate Program at Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in Washington, D.C. And finally, last but very much not least, we have Zhang Jian, Cheng has returned to Columbia. Cheng is also a fellow at the Center on Global Energy Policy, where he's worked as deputy director of our China program. He was commercial manager with ConocoPhillips Global LNG Group in Beijing. He's been an economist at the Environmental Defense Fund. Most important, he has his master's degree from SIPA and his BA from China Foreign Affairs University in Beijing. And I'd like to acknowledge one other person who is not here tonight, Anders Hove, my co-author on this report. Anders lives in Beijing, couldn't be here tonight, but he is a veteran of energy and issues in China. He's currently project director at GIZ in China and a non-resident fellow at the Center on Global Energy Policy with several degrees in Beijing. And we're really thrilled that Anders was able to play such a central part in this project. So this event, like all those at the center, is being webcast live. The full video will be available on our website in coming days. For those of you who are watching online, as well as people here in the audience, you can ask a question for the panelists anytime using the hashtag @CGP Events. And our Twitter handle is @ColumbiaUEnergy. So hashtag CGEP Events and @ColumbiaUEnergy for anybody who wants to ask questions. So let me just tee up our conversation tonight with some basic facts. So China and the United States are the world's two largest electric vehicle markets. This graph shows the increase in sales of electric vehicles in both markets and the rest of the world from 2010 to 2018. China last year, there were 1.25 million electric vehicles sold. In the United States, 361,000, so about roughly four times as many electric vehicles sold in China as in the United States. In China, the growth rate was about 60, in the area of 60%, in the United States about 80%, so both markets are really exploding in terms of electric vehicle sales. There's some differences between the markets. One of the biggest differences is that in China, there's a huge number of electric buses that are being sold. Somewhere between 100 and 200,000 last year, electric buses were sold. In the United States, that market is just beginning to take off. But China has become by far the world's largest electric vehicle market in the world, and the United States is number 2. Here's just a word about our study. We interviewed 50 people for this study, about half in China, half in the United States, across a range of different sectors: government, utility, academics, automotive industry, and others. And then we surveyed the Chinese and the English language literature on this topic, and that the results that we're presenting are based upon research done in 2018, both through these interviews and then through researching the literature. I should note this is a very dynamic industry, and that's one of the things we'll talk about. So this is changing very rapidly. It's one of the things I found so fascinating about it. So some basic statistics about EV charging in China, which is what we focus on in this report. There are at least 800,000 charging posts in China at year-end in 2018. This is data from the Electric Vehicle Charging Infrastructure Promotion Alliance. It's the English title for this group. And their year-end statistics say at least 330,000 public chargers in China and 480,000 home chargers. We think that actual figures may be higher, that the home charger figure could be underestimated. Many electric vehicles in China are sold with home chargers that are then installed along with the vehicle, and there have been almost 2 million electric vehicles sold for personal use in China. So we think this is probably a floor, and there may actually be more home chargers in China than these figures reflect. But these are the best available statistics at this point. There's a growing highway network in China, largely deployed by China State Grid, not entirely. And this is a map of the growing highway network of DC fast chargers that's growing all over China right now. And then this is something you don't see in the United States, fly line charging in some cities. Parking is a real challenge in China, and many people who own electric vehicles have trouble parking, and they have trouble getting access to chargers, so you see these electric cords from apartment buildings all the way down to vehicles in a number of Chinese cities right now. In the United States, there are at least 500,000 charging posts as of year-end 2018. The overwhelming majority of them are home chargers. About 80% of charging in the United States is done at home or at work, but most of it is done at home. And there's not good data in the United States about the number of home chargers that's sold. We weren't able to find publicly available data about the total number of home chargers that have been sold. There is pretty good data about the number of non-residential chargers that have been sold in the United States. The US DOE collects that on an ongoing basis, and at year-end 2018 identified 67,500 non-residential chargers at 24,000 stations across the United States, and with a growing highway network. So this is an infrastructure that's in its early stages. It's just growing. There's a lot of issues involved with a growing infrastructure like this. One issue that's often identified here is a so-called chicken and egg problem. It's a chicken and egg problem with the sale of electric vehicles and the sale of charger and charging infrastructure. Many car buyers, when you ask them whether or not they want to buy an electric car, they say, we're worried about buying an electric car. This is in the United States. We're worried about buying an electric car because we're not sure there's going to be chargers available. However, once people buy electric cars, they rarely use those public chargers. And there's a chicken and egg problem there, which makes it very challenging to kind of scale up this infrastructure. And that's something the industry is dealing with now. One conclusion of our study, which we found interesting, is that there's little overlap between the charging network providers in China and the United States. This Venn diagram shows really the only company that's in both markets in a significant way is Tesla. On the left, you see the Chinese providers. On the right, you see US providers. There's just not that much overlap. And that's one reason we thought a study like this might be helpful to provide information about what's happening in each country in this very dynamic, changing market. Some Chinese charging providers do have offices in the US. BYD, which does provide EV charging in China, does have real operations in the United States. They're starting to scale up, but there's just not that much overlap between the markets. And then even when you start to broaden out to other stakeholders, you find limited overlap. There's some. This shows the top 5 electric vehicle manufacturers in China. Some companies that most Americans have never heard of are providing, these are the top 5 manufacturers of electric vehicles in China. And they have, except for BYD, they don't really have operations in the United States. The top 5 electric vehicle manufacturers in the US do have operations in China. And then the utilities have very limited operations in each country. So there's some overlap, but not a huge amount of overlap between the two markets. Our report, we looked at policy, technology, and business models with respect to electric vehicle charging. And we started looking at policy, and in China, a couple of observations about electric vehicle charging policy in China. First, the Chinese central government promotes EV charging as a matter of national policy. It sets targets for the number of EV chargers. It provides funding via state-owned grid companies like State Grid. It mandates charging standards. It plays a pretty active role in electric vehicle charging infrastructure. This is a contrast with the United States. And then many provincial and local governments also support EV charging. Many provincial and local governments in China support electric vehicle deployment with license plate policies. In many cities in China, it's very difficult to get a license plate for a conventional vehicle, but relatively easy to get one for an electric vehicle, or it can be very expensive to get a license plate for a conventional vehicle, but much cheaper for an electric vehicle. And then provincial and local governments also are involved in deploying chargers with financial incentives and requirements with respect to new building construction. In the United States, in contrast, as I mentioned, the US government plays really a very minor role in electric vehicle charging. There was a 30% tax credit up to $1,000, which is not really, it would expired at the end of 2017. Then the US federal government has a designation for EV charging corridors on some interstates. It has loan guarantee authority that hasn't been used. And there's a voluntary program the Department of Energy runs in this. But the role of the US federal government is really quite modest. State and local policies have been much more significant in scaling up electric vehicle charging. There's some rebates, tax credits, tax exemption, grants, loans, and other policies from state governments, in particular California, and Washington State, New York, are some of the leading states in this area. After looking at policies, we looked at charging technologies, and kind of one general comment is that the technologies in both countries are broadly similar. In both countries, cords and plugs are the way electric vehicles are being charged. There are other ways of charging electric vehicles, at least in theory. Battery swapping is something that people in the industry talk about. Inductive charging without cords and plugs is another option. But those technologies have at most a minor presence in both countries. There is one country that's starting to roll out battery swapping in South China right now. But there's very little, almost everything is cords and plugs. One difference is that China has a single fast charging standard, which is called GBT. In the US, there are 3 different fast charging standards. CHAdeMO, which is a Japanese standard, CCSSAE, which is a European standard, then Tesla's. We asked, we asked all the American interviewees whether they thought that the fact that there are 3 charging standards was a barrier to expansion of this sector, and almost everybody said no. Almost everybody said it's true that there are 3 standards in the United States, but we don't see this being a big barrier, largely because you can have 3 different cords at any single charger, and there's other ways of adaptability and interoperability that are not that expensive. So although we have 3 standards, at least in our interviews, we didn't find experts saying they thought it was a big barrier. Chargers cost less in China. We went to different websites to see for your home charger how much they cost. In China, the cost is roughly half those of chargers in the United States. United States chargers cost today, a home charger costs about $500, and labor costs will vary depending upon circumstances. In China, the cost is about $250 in RMB terms. So chargers tend to cost less in China. One observation about the vehicle fleets is that the average range of electric vehicles is less in China. And here we have a graph that shows this data with the red are Chinese, the top 10 selling Chinese models in 2018 at the top, and the top 10 selling US models at the bottom. The average range in China is about 124 miles. The average range in the US is almost twice that, at 228 miles. And this is mainly due to the dominance of Tesla and the Bolt, the Chevy Bolt in the United States, both of which have pretty long ranges. So, but we thought that was relevant to the study because if there's shorter electric vehicle range, that implies the need for greater density of electric vehicle charging infrastructure in China. So in both countries, EV charging is a new dynamic industry. This is different than filling your car with gasoline or diesel. And just a few observations about that, which we talk about in our report. First, EV charging is different than traditional gasoline or diesel fueling by location. As I said earlier, most EV charging takes place at home. EV charging is kind of like, it's a cross between filling your car with gasoline and plugging in your cell phone. And you tend to plug in your cell phone where you're going to be for a little while, and people tend to plug in their car where they're going to be for a little while. So most EV charging takes place at home, which is obviously a big contrast with filling your car at a gasoline station. The duration is another issue, is another difference. It takes longer to fill a car with gasoline or diesel. It takes longer to fill a car with electricity than it does with gasoline or diesel. Cost is another difference. It's cheaper to recharge your vehicle than it is to refill your car with gasoline or diesel. That's good if you're a driver. If you're a business trying to provide charging services, it means there's less revenue potential. But it's a difference between the two. The role of utilities is much more central in electric vehicle charging. And then the role of government is different too. For decades, the oil and gas industry benefited from support for its infrastructure. That's shifting now, and there's a lot of support, government support right now for electric vehicles. Many governments around the world, including in China and the United States, see promoting electric vehicles as promoting social objectives. And so there's a lot of favorable policies for electric vehicles today. So as I said, it's a highly dynamic sector with lots of different business models, lots of different partnerships, lots of players. We talk about this in the report. There's independent charging networks, utility companies, auto manufacturers, shopping malls and businesses, fueling stations. The sharing economy is playing a role. Mobile charging units with vehicles that drive around with batteries to recharge your electric vehicle are out there. Commercial parking lots, municipal charging, all of these. There's partnerships between all kinds of different combinations of these players that are underway right now. So I'll just talk about a few of these players and then wrap up. So independent charging networks are growing in both China and the United States. These are also sometimes called pure play companies. By independent, we mean not owned by an auto company and not owned by a utility. And in China, the largest two networks are called T-Good and StarCharge. Both have over 50,000 charging posts. And our interview suggested a lot of concern from these companies about profitability and that they weren't making enough money because of regulated charging prices. In the United States, the largest networks are ChargePoint, EVgo, Blink, and Greenlots. And in both countries, these operate in a lot of different places, including malls, hotels, apartment complexes. Utility charging networks are active in both China and the United States. They're more active in China. State Grid and China Southern Grid both have chargers in major cities and corridors. And in the United States, utility investments vary widely by state. In some states, regulators have given permission to utilities to invest in EV charging infrastructure. In others, less. In others, that hasn't happened yet. But many electric utilities are quite interested in investing in this sector because of the possibility for increasing electricity sales and increasing return on regulated assets. There are auto manufacturer networks too. In China, BYD and Tesla are the only large ones. In the United States, Tesla is by far the largest. Tesla's built a national fast charging network along highway corridors. Nissan is partnered with Greenlots and EVgo, and then the new one that's growing right now is Electrify America, which grew out of the Dieselgate scandal with money from that settlement, and it's in the early stages of building up a nationwide EV charging network. So we asked, what could China and the United States learn from each other, having surveyed the industries in both countries, and we came up with these thoughts. First, we think the US could learn from China's long-range planning for EV infrastructure. Striking for an American spending time in China, there's a culture of long-term planning in China that just doesn't exist in the United States. China is on its 13th five-year plan. Last week we celebrated in the United States because our government passed a one-year appropriations bill. So there's a big difference. And when you're building up infrastructure over a long term, that type of culture of long-term planning makes a big difference. And so you see that, and we think the United States could learn from and take lessons from China when it comes to long-term planning. And then a number of Chinese companies, including State Grid, are investing very heavily in collecting and analyzing charging data, and State Grid has really impressive visualization tools and real time, some of which are on their websites, by the way, which you could go take a look at, and others are in their headquarters in Beijing and available for public tours. But there's a lot of investment going into collecting data, which could benefit the US industry as well. We think China could learn from the US's more market-driven approach to EV charging locations. One of the ways that chargers have grown in China is businesses have been mandated to build them. That has led to some businesses building chargers on sidewalks where cars can't even go. We have a picture of that right here from Beijing. This is, by the way, not a common occurrence in China, but this is kind of a classic regulatory or business response to a regulatory mandate that doesn't have any other guidance associated with it. And in the United States, we're much more market-driven in the way we cite these, and we think that Chinese industry could learn from that. And then the US experience with demand response as well. I think utilities in the United States are starting to experiment with using electric vehicles as grid assets for demand response, which is scaling back electricity in order to address mismatch between demand and load. And we think the United States is ahead of China on that, and we think there's lessons that Chinese utilities could learn from that. And then both countries could learn from each other when it comes to EV business models. As this is a really dynamic sector, as I've said a couple of times, there's lots of different changes that are happening. Lots of companies are experimenting with how do you make money in this sector, and keeping an eye on who's succeeding in what ways we think could benefit both countries. And so, again, I want to thank my co-author, Anders Hove, for his work on this, and the Center on Global Energy Policy for support, and Bloomberg Philanthropies for supporting this work. And with that, I will turn it over to Shirley Chung from State Grid, who will give a short presentation on her thoughts on this topic.
Yeah, that's right. Start from the very beginning. No, that's the last page. Let me go from the very beginning. Good. Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you, David, for your introduction, and thank you for having me here tonight. Actually, I think David's presentation has told you most of the what is happening nowadays in Chinese EV charging markets. And I just have a few slides to tell you more about State Grid and what we've been done and what we're going to do. So these slides show in the year of 2018, more e-vehicles were sold compared with conventional diesel engine cars. So currently there are about 1 million e-vehicles running in China. And according to the current growth, as well as the growth of charging facilities in China, many experts predicted that by the year of 2030, China's EVs will reach about 100 million. And some people believe it's still quite conservative forecast, and some people believe there'll be more than, even more than 2 million by the year of 2030. But yeah, according to the quite conservative forecast, in the year of 2040, EV will be around 200 million. Again, it's quite conservative, and more aggressive prediction is more than almost 500 million by the year of 2040 by some experts. Yeah, as David mentioned a moment ago, State Grid has developed a lot of EV charging piles, started from a few years ago, and in terms of the number of the charging piles, the piles facilities owned by State Grid ranking number 2 in China, and the first one is T-Good. Standard is always the most important issue when we really develop a streamlined industry, and we started the started to draft the standard according to our operation experience in power sector about 5 years ago. So currently we have proposed quite a few national standards, and we also cooperate with IEC to finally draft and complete 4 international standards together with the International Electric Commission. And on the other hand, we have also built equipment R&D and testing and fabrication facilities together with local partners and R&D institutions. That is the data platform David mentioned a moment ago, especially the picture on the left side. That is a data platform generated by State Grid, and you can also see that in our website. The overall investment for the e-vehicle facilities by State Grid is about $300.5 billion, and many people asked, when can you get the money back? It's a good question, and I think the driving force for State Grid to do so is social responsibility on one part. But on the other hand, as David mentioned a moment ago, any infrastructure facilities like e-charging does need long-term investment and long-term return. And it's also the nature for the power system. We never see any hot money come and go in this system because we does need a very reliable system to ensure the overall operation of the overall industry. And that is the management system, smart internet of vehicle. And I think we have open platform for visitors as well. And this platform has won the 2018 Edison Electrical Institution International Award in the year of 2018. And I think they still have a video show on EEI website. Another very important thing is apps. Apps is so close to our daily life nowadays, and apps developed by State Grid has been widely used as well. So what's next? It's an interesting picture. The left side, I got it from David's book, and I don't think my colleagues in Beijing will like it because it's kind of a flying line all the way from 7th floor down to the e-vehicles on the ground. So, but that's real life nowadays, because unfortunately, China is not as gifted as United States, especially not as gifted as California. Everybody will have a single family house, and you can have a very convenience of a charging facility everywhere, almost everywhere in San Francisco. What we are facing nowadays in China is a big complex. In Beijing, in Shanghai, in Guangzhou. And the people who live in the big complex are the potential customers for e-vehicle. So how can you imagine we have a charging facility for every household in the garage of a big complex? So it does need a balance between the universality, or otherwise publicity, and convenience. I know many US e-vehicles, especially manufacturers, they focus a lot on convenience. But convenience is only part of the story. Only when you encourage people to use more e-vehicle, then facilitated by more publicized charging facility, can more people to be encouraged to use e-vehicles. So I believe the e-charging nowadays built by State Grid and other utilities will make the e-vehicle stream come true for most people in China. And what we've been done nowadays is a combined effort together with China Southern Grid. Okay, it's interesting, so charged. It's called the Sheng Lianxing. And it's a new company by China Grid, Southern Grid, and several private companies to generate a more open platform for charging facilities as well as information shares. So combined with energy storage, EV charge, and solar PV has great potential. The going to be a lot of models in terms of V2V, V2H, V2B, V2G will be involving along with the ramping up of e-vehicles in the market. And again, as David mentioned a moment ago, e-vehicle is a new market, not only in China, not only in US, but the whole world. So we does need a collaboration between public sector, private sector, and the government. And in particular, in the policy point of view, the government will play a very important role to encourage more private companies to be involved. And having said that, I believe a business model nowadays is the focus of every investors, not only utility like us, but also, more importantly, the private investors. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Shirley. That was great. Now, let me invite Kevin, too, to the podium.
David, thank you very much for the introduction. It's a great pleasure for me to come here to support David's report launch event. I would like to talk about EV charging in the context of China's rising energy policy challenges. Just now, David mentioned China's electrical vehicle development has been very successful. If we look at the involvement of the EV stock in China, basically China accounts for about half of global total of EV stock. So we need to examine why the Chinese EV development has been so successful. Then the role of the government should be carefully looked at. If we look at the left side of the graph, the yellow line is the public charging post versus the number of EV in China. If we look at the year 2012, the ratio actually is above 1, which means for each electrical vehicle in China, there was more than one public charging post, which indicates two facts. The first one, there's a very strong and consistent support from the Chinese government to support the infrastructure development of the electrical vehicle industry. The second issue is it has already been mentioned by David. It's because the driving range of Chinese EVs is lower than the United States. But if we look at the other side of the pictures, this is low-speed EV production in Shandong. This is actually not part of the data reported in the EV stock in the left side. The reason is very simple. When we look at the EV development and other high-tech sector development in China, Chinese government does not only have a hand-on attitude to support the industry development, it also shows a tendency of hand-off attitude to allow the industry grow before it's tightly regulated by the central and local government. You may view this as a contradiction within the Chinese energy development, but in the Chinese context, this type of contradiction actually is very helpful for the government to stimulate many high-tech sector development. Then let's look at the competition in the Chinese market. China's energy sector has evolved from a planned economy before 1978 to an increasingly market-oriented development. However, if we look at the share of the EV batteries sector in China, the market share in China increased very quickly. In 2017, China now accounts for 60% of a global total. When we look at such high market share, this inevitably will impose lots of tension in international trade. So this is one of the reasons why recently there is an ongoing US-China trade war. But on the other hand, this also creates tension within the Chinese system. If we look at how the number of EV battery manufacturers evolved in China, back in 2015, the number was around 450, but in 2018, the recent number is far less than 100. So this type of industry policy, on the one hand, is very efficient to improve the competitiveness of the Chinese enterprise, but on the other hand, this will lead to lots of waste of resources. Another important driving force of the electrical vehicle development in China is the rising importance of energy security. If we look at the oil and gas dependency rates in China and the US, because of the success of US shale gas revolution, in 2017, the United States dependence rate on oil imports has been less than 20%, but in comparison, the similar ratio in China increased very rapidly. Last year, the ratio was 70%. This is much higher than the historical peak ratio in the US at around 60%. The similar situation holds in the gas sector. US has already become a net gas exporter in 2017, but China's dependence rate on gas imports reached 45% last year. In absence of a trade war between these two countries, the success of US shale gas revolution is a blessing for China's energy security. But because of the ongoing trade war, the problem is Chinese decision makers are likely to become much more energy security conscious. In other words, in order to reduce China's oil consumption growth, decision makers in China will examine all different measurements, such as coal to oil, conversion coal to chemical, electrification of China's vehicle fleet. So this will become an increasingly important driving force in China's energy landscape. To conclude my presentation, I have three take-home messages. The first one is the economic structure shift and the geopolitical tension have brought lots of uncertainty to China's energy transformations. This will have very profound implications for global energy trade and also global climate politics. More specifically, because of the US-China trade war, Chinese decision makers will become much more conscious regarding energy security China is expected to double down on efforts to suppress oil demand growth, including electrification of vehicle fleets. The second take-home message is that US and China are the two largest EV market, but EV charging industry are growing most independent of the other. So in the future, how decision makers in these two countries could find creative ways to make bilateral cooperation mutually beneficial. This is a big question mark that need political wisdom from not only Beijing, but also Washington, D.C. Last but not least, data availability and reliability is very important for stimulate high-tech sector development in not only US, China, but also the rest of the world. In this regard, key stakeholders, including government, industrial alliance, and grid, including SGCC, should have a very important role to play. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Kevin. And then let me welcome to the podium Zhang Jian, Fellow at Center on Global Energy Policy.
Thank you, David, for your invite. It's good to be back to this campus. All the three aspects just mentioned about the charging market in China, being a resident in Beijing, I would like to share some of the updates and observations about EV industry in general in China. So I've got 5 points to be discussed as my observation. Hopefully that could be a good discussion, kick off our panel later. One, I think three experts just mentioned, the EV market is actually very reliant on the policy because it's a new industry, and that is true. The Chinese government actually provided gigantic subsidy plans starting from 2016 to 2020, which means this subsidy plans is going to be stopped by 2020. And this is going to be a significant impact towards the EV manufacturing market. This year, in 2019, the subsidy scales is going to be cut to some extent. So what is going to be, such type of pressure will be passed along towards the industry. So I think it's become a huge question mark towards these Chinese EV manufacturing industries, that what will be the post-subsidy phase. A lot of people, if you're familiar with Chinese renewable energy market, knowing this kind of sad story of these solar panel manufacturing stories when these subsidies being cheated off, and then what a lot of solar panel manufacturers are actually go bankrupt, and I think such type of tragedies could probably likely to be happening for this manufacturing industry. So that's something I think is a very important thing that we should observe. Secondly, the Chinese EV market or the industry got a very complex governance, as all of the American audience might probably not know, but the EV industry got have a multiple government policy related. For example, this MIIT, the Ministry of Industry and the Information Technology, are in charge of this automobile management and also technology test. The National Development and Reform Commission, the NDRC, is the one who is in charge of this EV market investment and the project in endowment, and also they set up this press level for this charging service fees. Now, for the NEA, the National Energy Agencies are, on the contrary, are setting up this electricity price and also these electricity load-down forms. So in order to promote this EV industry, there do have this we call the ministerial level co-governance meeting to be held every certain interval in order to make sure that the policies, the incentive policies are go consistent among different ministries. But as we are studying for policies, you know that when there's multiple government agencies working together, these bureaucratic issues sometimes deliver very complex market signals to these players on the market. So I think the better coordinations among these government agencies must be done in order to promote a more healthy development for this EV industry. Now the third observation was talking about the charging business is just Shirley and David also mentioned, the charging business is actually quite, we call it a fully competitive business in China's market today. Of course, you have this car manufacturer who have provided their own charging networks, and State Grid also have its charging networks, but there are also independent charging service providers. Now, given this regulated price scheme in China, I think nowadays, especially for these mega cities in China, that they have these limitations on location, space, and the complexities. It's just very hard for them to come up with a very reasonable business model for the charging service. So David mentioned in the US, we have this egg and chicken egg and type of problems. I think in China, with the same thing is that now doing charging business looks like more on a social responsibility business rather than a healthy business model. So I think this is going to be solved. If not, it's very hard. We can share some of the charging experience that I personally have in Beijing, maybe later in the discussion. I think the fourth point I want to take away is that China has a very aggressive, we call it a new energy vehicle policy. But when we talk about new energy vehicles, it's not only about pure pure EV. It's not about pure electric vehicles. In this part, we actually omit another discussion, is the fuel cell. The fuel cell vehicles is going to have a quite large potential in Chinese new vehicle policies in the future. Well, a lot of times people will discuss that they're looking at this pure EV and the fuel cell vehicles are like competitors against this federal physical support. But in fact, if you're looking at today, the recent announced statistics, I think fuel cell cars and the pure EV cars are actually more complementary to other regards, as the EVs are very good, given these technology features, are very good for the city passenger cars. So for all this inner city commute, I think EV passenger cars are really become the certain roles, but the fuel cells cars could be play a very important role on the heavy-duty trucks or even intercity shuttle bus type of thing. So it's actually going to have a quite good ecosystem for EV and the fuel cell cars to work together. I think a lot of the Chinese government now already thinking of, after the EV policy and a sensitive speech finished, more aggressive fuel cell car vehicle policies are coming on the stage. So that's also some interesting point that we should pay attention to. The last but not least observation is that I think the EV industry is really a very complex industry. It's a lot of, now today we see a lot of interesting phenomenon in China is a lot of internet companies are just getting into this car manufacturing business, and they were just all building cars. But actually this is, when we think about EV industries, is a whole kind of, the supply chain matters. I think Shirley shared a very interesting point in terms of the EV and the solar could be good partners in order to bring a carbon-free type of business train, and I think that's possible and that's likely to do. A lot of times when people are talking about electric vehicles market, and they didn't pay attention to where this electricity come from. And in today's China's energy mix, and more than 60 or 70% of the electricity are still coming from coal. And in that regard, from this life cycle carbon footprint perspective, EV is not a carbon-free energy for tools that we were thinking about it. And then, of course, because of the different resources features for different cities, now at the beginning of this industry, the federal government also pulled out these policies that will be universal, and then, each of the places will have a very aggressive EV development plan. But then when this development get into a certain phase where I think each of the different cities will come up with their various plan in terms of how to apply their EV policies, or their EV industries, have a different applications among different geographical or city features. So I think that could be possible for the post-incentive phase, is that maybe in China, more cities or regions will come up with their own individual development plan in terms of how this EV market will be going. So I think these are 5 observations I would like to share, and then probably have more discussions in the panels. Thank you, David.
Thank you very much. For those of you who are listening on podcast, my name is David Sandalow. I'm the Inaugural Fellow at the Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia University. I'm joined here by Shirley Chung, the President of State Grid Corporation of China in the US, and Kevin Tu and Zhang Jian, both fellows at the Center on Global Energy Policy. We're talking about electric vehicle charging in China and the United States. And let me just ask a few questions of each of our panelists, and then I want to bring in the audience. I know we've got a lot of expertise in the audience. I want to offer a chance to answer questions, to ask questions as well. But let me start with Sheng, because Sheng, you live in Beijing, and I'm just curious. One, do you own an electric vehicle? Do your friends own electric vehicles? And what's the thinking process for people in China, in Beijing at least today, about whether or not to own an electric vehicle?
All right, so thank you, David. So first of all, I don't own a electric vehicle, and I would say this is the biggest regret I have after I moved back to Beijing 4 years ago. I own one car, and I'm trying to go through this very complex lottery process to get another car for my family, and I'm telling you it's impossible. So living in city in Beijing, we have this lottery process for people to get a chance to get we call the ticket or the plate quota. And in today's, the recent statistics showing that every 1,000 households who want to buy a car, only 3 of them get it. So barely, it's actually have an even smaller chance to win a big lottery prize. So it's very hard, and it's really a pain for households who are living in Beijing. I got lucky because my wife got one car right before the policy applied. But my point is that if I moved back 4 years ago, I got a chance if I do not go through the gasoline cars, I have a better chance to get electric vehicle cars. And there is a small, there's a queue that you do not go to the lottery process, but there's a smaller queue. Now because the gasoline cars are so hard to get, now the queue for waiting for EV cars is also taking longer. Now I think the recent number is that by 2022, you will be able to get a ticket to get an electricity car. So for me, it's like for 5 years, I don't have a chance. So I think this is giving us a sense is that the city is actually giving a lot of supportive policy in favor of electricity car. Like you do not have any limitations that you can drive 5 days a week on the street for EV, but if it's a gasoline car, you only drive 4 days a week. So I think a lot of my friends, they are smart. They actually buying EV instead of waiting and go through the lottery process. I think more and more people now are thinking of driving in the city. It's good to have an EV, and then it's just also save gasoline because of the bad traffic jam on the ring roads.
And Kevin, I know you're back in Beijing now. You have only been there for a short time. You were in Paris working at the IEA. Do you see electric vehicles on the road a lot? What do you experience from your time in Beijing?
I have seen lots of electrical vehicles in Beijing, in different parking lots and also on the road. When I toured different parts of the city to meet with friends and experts, I have also seen electrical vehicle owners. So I talked with them. In China, there's different reasons for people to buy EVs. Like in Beijing, in a few years ago, if you chose to buy EV, it's much easier to obtain the vehicle plates, the license plates. But there are also some people, especially experts, they are environmentally conscious. They choose to buy EVs because the technology itself is mature enough, especially in terms of allowing people to drive, to work in urban centers. Of course, during the Spring Festival, there's also so-called electrical vehicle charging anxieties because of range limitation of many Chinese EV models, and also because of the low temperature, which could reduce the driving range of EVs.
Okay, I want to follow up on one very interesting comment I thought I heard you make in your presentation, Kevin, just on, not on the experience of EVs, but more on policy point. And I thought you said that you thought that the trade war between the United States and China might actually lead the Chinese government to promote electrification of vehicles more. And is that, did I hear you correctly? And could you just expand upon your thinking and what the links are between the trade war and the electrification of the vehicle fleet in China?
If you look at the U.S.-China foreign, the dependence rate on foreign oil and gas, in China, the dependence rate on imported oil and gas have already exceeded to very high level. For oil now, last year it was 70%. For natural gas, 45%. In absence of the trade war, China could trust the international market, and China will benefit enormously from the oil and gas imports from the US. According to some Chinese think tank, the potential for the bilateral oil and gas trade could reach $50 billion in certain years. However, because of the trade war, then from a Chinese perspective, the Chinese decision makers are expected to become much more national security conscious. So not only for oil and gas, for any other strategically important commodities, Chinese decision maker will have a second source under the overarching political environment of ongoing trade war with the US. China will regard the world as a less safe place because of the trade war. If we look at the security arena, China doesn't have a presence in different parts of the world in terms of the military. So how will China react? I believe the decision makers in China need to find all available mechanism to allow the country to suppress the oil and gas consumption growth.
Shirley, so you work for, I think it might be the biggest company in the world. If not, it's one of the biggest companies in the world. Number two, you have, what, 1 billion customers, I think? Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's an enormous company. You mentioned that the investment in electric vehicle infrastructure is partly a matter of social responsibility, but also that State Grid needs to make a profit also. Could you just elaborate on that, and how does State Grid decide to invest in projects as social responsibility, and how does that decision process work?
Wow, it's a big issue, it's a big question. I mean, today is a present day here in the United States, and tomorrow will be Chinese Latin Festival. I'm not expecting a hard question like that.
Well, I meant it to be an easy question. So.
Yeah, but yeah, anyway, I mean, social responsibility is part of the a very important work for State Grid for many years. even before charging facilities of e-vehicle, I mean, in China we have a project called Power for All. It's rural electrification all the way to each and every household, and billions of dollars has been invested to make every household, even in the rural area, to be connected either to the local grid or otherwise to the national grid. And having said that, as I mentioned, e-vehicle is part of the responsibility at this moment, but for long run, I do believe the current investment does make sense for the long-term investment, because current tariff system nowadays in China is quite similar, so-called asset-based investment, asset-based return, in another way. Oh. So for once e-vehicle really become the mainstream, the real mainstream on the road, the current investment will get certain return based upon the current asset we owned. And because of we are the early bird in the market, and depends on the policy support, depends on the future business model. I mean, the current investment will become a certain of a new revenue resource in the coming years.
Just to be sure I understand what you mean, you're saying that the state grid makes a certain percentage of the investment that it makes.
Yeah.
So, right, in the United States, we call that a regulated rate of return for our investments. And it's the same, right. It's the same for Chinese system, is that right?
Yeah. And also another part of the story is we have seen tremendous development on the people's application on the e-charging piles, in particular along the highways. For example, from February 3rd to 10th of this year, which was Chinese New Year, many people drove their e-cars back home on the way to travel outside. And the charging network of State Grid provided about 15 million kilowatt-hour to e-vehicles, which about 154% growth compared with last year. And during this Chinese New Year period, there's two very significant features for this e-charging network. Number one, the charging facilities along, especially along the highways, were extremely busy. And about 17,000 times with about 240,000 kilowatt hours per day were provided by our charging system to the e-vehicle drivers. So which means about 180% higher than normal business day, in particular in Beijing, Tianjin, and the Shanghai area. Number two is we've noticed about 990,000 people are using our e-charging apps to get more information through this platform. So all of these are very important signs that the current investment, which is supposed to be social responsibility, will turn to another kind of revenue base in the coming year.
Let me ask any members of the audience, if you have questions, you can raise your hand. I think we've got microphones as well, and I see Dong in the back. Yeah. And please introduce yourself. And
hi, I'm Go Dong from the Earth Institute. I have a couple questions. Congratulations on the report, and it's a very interesting discussion. I'm wondering, in your EV calculations, also the number for the charging stations, do you consider the electric bicycles? Is that part of that? Because the translation can be very similar in Chinese. And I assume not, but if that's not the case, then do you see a future for electric bicycles? Because that's quite predominantly for deliveries, for medium and lower income groups, medium-sized cities. So that's one. And the other question is, I saw in one of your earlier slides that it seems like in China it's really mostly the auto companies that supply the charging station, but the United States is more like independent companies. So I'm wondering why that's the case.
so I'll start on the electric bicycles and then invite any of other panelists to answer that. So the answer is no. The numbers that we were providing don't include electric bicycles. And for people who spend time in China, electric bicycles are wildly popular in China. I mean, you have to be careful on the streets or the sidewalks in China now, right? Because the electric bicycles are coming and they're quiet and they're coming fast. And I mean, I've seen data like 200, I think there are 200 million at least electric bicycles have been sold in China, like 20 million a year, I think. I mean, so they're wildly popular. And the statistics that we were discussing don't include those vehicles. Many of them are actually lead acid batteries and are sometimes recharged. You can physically take them out and plug them in your apartment. That's basic technology. But anything to add on electric bicycles? Nope.
Yeah, and I think in terms of regulations, there's no very standardized electric bicycle regulations over there. So there's a lot of different manufacturers on the electric bicycles, and then that's also hard to put on the statistical, for the statistics analysis. But I think now, because of this safety issues, now I think the MIT also start to talking about how to better manage these electric bicycles, but from the battery perspective, not from the bike manufacturing perspective.
This is, by the way, I think there's a broader framework here, which is transitions in mobility that are happening. And we've had controversies in a number of cities around the United States where there are these mobile platforms like mobile scooters and mobile share bikes. And they're happening on an unregulated basis. They've caused injuries, and it's been controversial in some cities. This is, I think the kind of clean dividing lines that used to separate different modes of transportation seem to be blurring as different technologies come together and as apps enable the sharing that didn't exist before. So, in the back there.
Hi, I'm Bill Hewitt from NYU Center for Global Affairs. And first I was heartened by hearing about the fuel cell vehicle technology that's in the offing. I think obviously that's hugely important, not only for China, but for the rest of the world. But my question is regarding whether or not autonomous vehicle technology is being incorporated into your electric vehicle policy and business models, et cetera. Waymo, which is a Google company, has ordered something like 80,000 EVs to be fitted with AV technology. So to what extent will we be seeing any of that in China?
Well, thank you for the question. I think David and I, we spend a lot of time doing expert review interviews with the Chinese, we call renewable energy interviews. And in our discussions, I think in these, as I mentioned, in these new energy vehicle policies, in the beginning, I think fuel cell and electric vehicles are the two options that a lot of people were discussing about it. But I think starting from the 2010, I think the Chinese federal government decided to apply electric vehicles as one of the more sort of prioritized policy to incentivize this industry grow. And fuel cells still going on, but like just given this nature of the technology and the readiness, I don't think that the federal government actually putting much more consider and then the policy designing for this. Now, I think the Toyotas commercially applied fuel cell really bring some different ideas, and then I think this government realized this probably it's also a likely technology pathway to go with. So we discussed with many of this automobile industry association experts. They're saying that now they're designing this, drafting this China's fuel cell automobile development plan by 2035. So we do think that there are more sort of discussions on fuel cell that could be, as I mentioned, I think, personal speaking, I think first of all, vehicles and the EVs, they're not complete with each other. They're actually pretty complementary given the nature of this technology and to fulfill the whole communication and transportation demand for city.
And how about on self-driving vehicles? Are any of you familiar with what's happening in China on self-driving vehicles?
Too early to.
There's some preliminary activity in this space for sure, and in general, the Chinese government is investing very heavily in advanced technology platforms like artificial intelligence and the type of sensing technologies that are used in self-driving vehicles. Most of the self-driving vehicles that are out on a pilot basis do use electric drivetrains, so there is some connection there. But just like in the United States, it's very early stage for this technology. I saw a question here. Yes, sir.
My name is Ray Gerald. Excuse my voice. My name is Ray Gerald. I'm just an interested investor. Given the forecast for some 200 million electric vehicles by 2030, and what seems like a very unsettled types of business models with constraints on revenue pricing, what changes in business model would you contemplate in order for the forecast to be realized?
That's a big question. Any thoughts? I think, look, I'll take a stab at that. One is a question on business models for electric vehicles and then for electric vehicle charging. Our report focused on electric vehicle charging, so I've been thinking more about that. I think we're going to see in lots of creative partnerships that don't exist yet. One example that we're seeing in the United States is electric vehicle charging provided as an amenity in shopping centers, in restaurants and places like that, where the owner of the mall or the owner of the restaurant provides free electric vehicle charging for customers to come in, because the cost of doing that is much less than the revenue that they'll get from the customer coming into the store and spending money. That's happening in China some, but a little bit less, partly because parking is more expensive in China. The space is more valuable because it's so crowded. But I think there's going to be some interesting partnerships that emerge in that space. Another that I think the Chinese sector will probably be out ahead of the United States on is in the use of mobile apps. In general, the use of mobile platforms is much more advanced in China than it is in the United States. Actually, I had a story on that. I had a student about a year ago, a Chinese student who came to me. She was here in the United States for the first time. She'd never been here, grew up in China, and she said, "Professor Sandalow, it's so old-fashioned here in the United States. I have to carry around cash or credit cards to pay for things. I'm not used to this." And that's the experience of somebody living in China today, when mobile pay is essentially ubiquitous. And so the sophistication levels with mobile platforms is much higher in China than it is in the United States. And I think that there's a likelihood of movement towards sharing and other types of information systems. You heard Shirley Chung talk about how State Grid is investing in mobile apps. I think this is one example of it. Any other thoughts?
One more addition. If you look at the business model of SGCC, they have invested very heavily on electrical vehicle chargers along Chinese highways. Once those investment is made, from the EV industry's perspective, as long as the operation cost could be covered, the existence of a large number of the EV infrastructure along China's highway network could encourage the continuous purchase of EV by Chinese customers. This is a sort of chicken and an egg problem, but in the Chinese context, because the existence of key state-owned enterprise, somehow China have addressed this dilemma with approach with Chinese characteristics. But in the longer term, this could be quite helpful to promote the EV stock involvement in the country.
Thank you. Yes. Yes, sir.
Hi, I'm Patrick Cheng from the Spark Hill Group. Thank you guys for coming. This is a big business, electric vehicles, electric batteries. So there's going to be creative destruction that's going to occur. So my question is more on the political stages. For the US side, there are political forces that are going to be against this and for this. For example, big oil is clearly not in favor of this. And then in China, the auto manufacturers are all SOE owned, and they're in trouble because once you have electric vehicles, their business is going to go down, which we've seen with all the auto numbers recently. So how do you combat against the political forces in the US and China when you have such, let's call it creative destruction that's going to occur? Because from what I last read and what I've last seen and witnessed is, especially in China, private electric vehicle manufacturers that weren't affiliated with the SOEs actually had problems getting licenses. You need 2 licenses, as you mentioned, one from the MIIT and one from the NRDC. But a policy just came out recently that pushed it to provincial level. And the policy has changed twice for subsidies based on mileage over the year. So that puts the private sector at a disadvantage because they don't have the capital. The SOEs are flush. So my question is more to the political stage. How do you battle against it and with it on the US and the China side?
It's a great question. I'll start and see if other panelists want to comment on it. Particularly in the United States, I think your question is interesting. I don't know that I agree with your premise. I think it's true that there are some forces that will fight against electric vehicle deployment, but we've seen some of the major oil companies invest, or excuse me, some of the major car companies invest pretty heavily in getting out ahead in this technology. Not all of them. Some of them have held back, but you've got obviously Nissan and BMW, General Motors. They've invested pretty heavily in deploying in this space now. And then you've got, then you have pure play companies like Tesla who are investing too. So I think there's some of both going on, but I'm not sure I agree with your premise that there's going to be a huge amount of resistance from the industry on this. I think to the extent that there is, this is a familiar tale of incumbents resisting change, and they're successful at doing that for a while. But then once the technology becomes clearly competitive, there's a momentum that becomes unstoppable. And I think we're seeing that to some extent. It's a very significant extent right now with solar power, which has become so cheap in some places that it's that's competitive with all other forms of electric power. And the projections are that battery costs will come down enough that electric vehicles will be in a similar place within the next decade or so. There's different estimates on that, but I think at that point the technology becomes so attractive that the momentum becomes unstoppable.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I catch up your question very precisely, but I do believe it's more business-oriented instead of any political background on that. Because even before the booming of charging facilities, a lot of car manufacturers started to pay a lot of attention on e-vehicles already, including BYD, including BMW. I still remember about 5 or 6 years ago, BMW and other car manufacturers in Europe started to talk about establishment of ally together with the local utilities in China. So it will be very much related to the advance of technology instead of only focus on the political situation. That's my understanding.
Other questions?
I
want to get in a number of questions. So, yeah, Noah.
This is a question for Ms. Chung. I was surprised to see that State Grid had the second largest charging network in China, in particular because if they want to be the largest, they can very easily put everybody else out of business by raising rates. So what is State Grid's long-term policy for providing charging? Do they want to continue to be a middle player? Do they want to eventually bow out? Or do they eventually want to sell all the electricity for charging?
Thank you for the question. The mission of our company is in search of excellence and in pursuit of transcendence. So we will always try to be the #1 in the industry. But the good part is, the charging facilities, this part of business is open to both public and private. And I do believe that because the private investors, they do see it's a good opportunity for the business, and that's why they have more investment in this sector. And in my the slides, which has been flipped quite quickly, it was actually a joint venture between State Grid, China Southern and T-Good and Star Charging. It's a joint venture between public and private. So as I said, despite I want to be the number one, but this charging facility, given it's a new situation, new market in the whole society, we do need collaboration with all partners.
Yes, yes, ma'am.
Hello, my name is Colleen Quinn, and I'm an advisor in the e-mobility sector, having just transitioned from 9 years with ChargePoint as the Senior VP for Global Policy. So I was basically, I think, along with David, a pioneer in the US on putting together, in our view, we think, a successful business model for EV charging infrastructure. And I was a little surprised, but that I would say that the most important contribution to the success of ChargePoint has been really the evolution of the workplace charging sector. And that's primarily because the business model of ChargePoint is not to own the charging stations. We finance the company basically one parking space at a time. So the businesses invest. And so your point, David, about the amenity, the fact that these companies actually put the charging infrastructure in, not really to make money, but more of not just an amenity, but really to support their employees in some cases and their social responsibility, ambitions, and environment, et cetera. So that's one thing. And I guess my question is, how have the businesses in China responded to EV charging infrastructure? The 80% number, David, that you used is really, I think, a shared home, workplace, and home charging in the US. It's hard to see the stats of the workplace charging because it tends to be behind the fence. So they're not publicly, you don't see them on the DOE numbers. So how does that, how are the numbers in China on the workplace side?
I do not have a specific statistics at this moment, but what I know about the tariff issue related to how many charging posts in each facilities. I mean, the current public charging tariff for the public pole is electricity tariff plus service charge. So it very much depends on where the charging pole is. If the charging pole is in the parking lot of the complex, and the tariff is based upon the domestic tariff. And if you're charging your car in the commercial building, it's commercial tariff.
Which is higher?
Which is higher. I mean, commercial is higher.
Commercial.
Commercial is higher. Tariff, domestic is lower. But the thing is, for big complex, the overall distribution property of that complex does not belong to state grid. So you have to talk with the property owner to really establish a charging pole. That will be very hard. So instead, a lot of the charging poles are actually more public oriented in commercial buildings along the highways. And the tariff on the poles of highways is based upon the commercial tariff. So according to the NDRC's regulation, before the year of 2025, there is no capacity charge along the poles, on the posts along the highways. And the service charge for this poles along highways is linked with number 92 gasoline price.
Could you just elaborate on that?
I mean,
linked how?
The service charge is linked with number 92 gasoline charge. Gasoline price, and there is a certain percentage, certain to maximize the service charge on the poles along the highways. So along with the more market orientation in terms of the poles along the highway in particular, it is believed that the service charge will be delinked with the gasoline charge.
Thank you for bringing in workplace charging, by the way, which, the charging as an amenity is very much an issue, not just of retail outlets, which I mentioned, but also employers doing the same thing. And I'd love to follow up afterwards, because I've looked at some of that data, I've been trying to understand it, so let's connect afterwards on that. We have about 5 more minutes, and I see a number of hands, so let me take a number of questions and then get just some final comments. Yeah, in the front row.
Hello, my name is David Wilson. So Volkswagen in their Electrify America network, pursuant to Dieselgate, they have an interesting business approach. They use batteries to do DC charging, which of course is much faster. And the thing that's interesting to me about their approach is over time, as a car, its battery, maybe it falls to 70% of its original capacity, the question is, what do you do with it? And so what their idea is that they will recycle these batteries into EV charging locations, including mobile locations when there's a big football game or something. So do you think that approach is particularly applicable in America, where the local distribution network is a real constraint, particularly with the smaller transformers, the so-called last mile problem? I think that's much less of an issue in China, but I'm wondering if you think that the Volkswagen approach has any applicability to China.
I'm going to get a few more questions and then we'll come back and, yeah, right here.
Thank you all. My name is Ben Mandel. I'm with a national clean transportation nonprofit technology consortium called CalStart. And we're actually working with ChargePoint on a workplace charging program here in the New York City area called Charge to Work New York. So we appreciate that point. At the same time, I wanted to dig in a little bit with you all probably on some of the economic points that were touched on in all of your presentations. So David, I think you tried, of course, to paint a sort of broad picture of the economics and how charging your vehicle with electricity is characteristically cheaper than fueling with gasoline. And I think what we've found in the US, particularly Rocky Mountain Institute and some others have run some numbers to show that if you rely on public DC fast charging, that's not necessarily the case. And that's very important as we think about Lyft, as an example, making its green mode available in certain US markets. And so those kinds of drivers who need to rely on fast charging, we need to make sure the economics do pencil. So I wanted to dig in a little more to understand if maybe that were, in fact, the case more in China, where the DC fast charge component enables more of fleets to electrify fully because it is, in fact, cheaper and you don't have those same barriers. I know you just mentioned the capacity charge moratorium, which maybe sounds like demand charges here, if I'm understanding that correctly. So might that be a really fundamental difference between the two markets?
So with apologies to other people who have their hands up, we are about out of time. One of our rules here at the Center on Global Energy Policy, we start on time and we end on time. I think some of our speakers can stay around afterwards to answer some questions, but let me just give our speakers a chance for kind of any final comments, and then we're going to wrap up right on time. And let me just go this way, start with Shirley, and then go to Cheng for any final comments you might have. Any thoughts on either of those questions, or any final thoughts?
Well, for these two questions, I think there are a little bit similarities in terms of your two questions. What I understand is a few years ago, when battery is not as advanced as nowadays, State Grid promoted a kind of a swamping system, a swamping model, especially for big buses and the taxis. So in the evening, all these e-taxis, e-buses, they will change swamping the battery in a certain station, and during nighttime when this was base load, more clean energy will be used to charge these batteries, and in the morning they will be swapped back to the e-buses and e-taxis. But that is only good enough for the public transportation. It's not so good for the private e-vehicles in particular. You really want very fancy cars. So what we mentioned nowadays is, I think it's kind of a V2G, which means the vehicle back to grid. Technically, there's no big issue. And again, it's very much related to the pricing and the business model. And currently, unfortunately, what we have now is just a pilot project, and there is no clear business model or there's no clear policy nowadays from the government to identify how could V back to G.
Kevin and Sheng, with apologies, how about 60 seconds of final thoughts?
So I would like to answer a previous question about the political economy of the electric vehicle development in China. I think one of the important considerations is China lags far behind the Western companies in terms of the internal combustion engines technologies. So the EV development is regarded as a very good opportunity for China leapfrog towards the next generation of vehicle technologies. But meanwhile, it's very important to consider one factor that a government shouldn't handpick the winner of a technological competition. Because of this type of thinking, recently Chinese government also decided to stimulate fuel cell vehicle development because in the end, the Chinese government shouldn't be in the position to decide whether EV will be the future of the transportation sector. The industry policy of vehicle development in China should be technologically neutral in the future.
Sheng.
Well, I think I'll just really wrap up in 60 seconds. Is that I think EV business, EV charging business is a new industry. In a way, I think policy plays a really important role when you want to intensify a new industry, and that is true both in the US and in China, all different ranges. But eventually, this is innovation that come up with new business models. So I think just mentioned about battery swap or other type of talking about the new business models for the charging business is like people will come up with, and that's why a lot of startups actually now have a lot of chance and opportunities to come up with great ideas. So I think the here is that, and when certain level of this penetration achieved, I think the policy should be achieved and let the market decide. And I agree with Kevin, this technology neutral type of approach is that let the market decide. And I think that's also the similar story now. Even the SOEs are playing, and I don't think that actually at least business SOEs they are very competitive also, but I don't think they get a better advantage under this regard.
Well, you've been listening to Zhang Jian from the Center on Global Energy Policy, who just spoke. Before him, Kevin Tu, also from the Center on Global Energy Policy, and before him, Shirley Chung from State Grid Corporation of China. My name is David Sandalow with the Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia University. We have a couple of upcoming events to tell you about on Wednesday night. This Wednesday, February 20th at 6 p.m., we have a book launch on escaping energy. The book is called Escaping the Energy Poverty Trap. 6 o'clock at the International Affairs Building in room 1501. And next Tuesday, BP will be here. BP's Group Chief Economist, Spencer Dale, will be here to present BP's 2019 BP Energy Outlook at 9:30 a.m., actually, at the Princeton Club in New York. It's been a tremendous discussion. We could have kept on going for a long time, I think, based upon the number of hands there. So my apologies to those who weren't able to get to. It's been a fascinating conversation. Please join me in giving our panelists a big round of applause.